on the stage has plenty of stories because Viv Newman, Dr Viv Newman, is an expert in World War I matters, in particular when it comes to women and the role women played in World War I. Do come in and take a seat, grab a seat, and we'll chat to Viv for 10 minutes or so before we introduce the Colchester Military Wives Choir to the stage. Viv, great to hear from Sean there.
Absolutely, absolutely great.
The role that women were playing there, whilst all of this was kicking off, and the assassination, as we heard, and war breaks out in 1914, what did that mean for the Essex girls then of their time?
Well, it meant a great deal, not only for the Essex girls, but for women across the nations of the United Kingdom and indeed the Dominions, because women were very, very keen to do their bit and for the war effort as well. But, as Sean has just said, the war was going to be over by Christmas. And there was a particular group of women, I must admit they were a long way away, they were up in Scotland, but they were part of the United Kingdom, and they still are, just. So let's keep them in the story for the moment, shall we? Maybe it's the last time I can air them in this sort of setting. But there was a remarkable group of women, led originally by somebody called Dr Elsie Inglis. She was a qualified surgeon, doctor, and the day after war was declared, she went up to the headquarters of the War Office in Edinburgh, and she offered to send a funded completely by the Suffragettes and Suffragist Society, a completely self-funded ambulance and hospital unit to serve the British Army in France. The head of the War Office looked down his nose at Dr Elsie Inglis, this well-known Edinburgh surgeon, and said, "Dear lady, go home and sit still." Now, the one thing that you couldn't tell Dr Elsie Inglis to do was to sit still. She didn't actually know the meaning of that phrase. And she had a group of other doctors who were equally committed to serving the wounded. So they decided that if they couldn't serve the British Army, they would offer their services to an army that desperately needed hospital help. And one group above all others that were desperate, but absolutely desperate for medical aid, were the Serbs. And so the Scottish Women's Hospital Unit, as they became known, went to Serbia, where they disinfected Serbia until it smelt of formaldehyde or chlorine, because the country was riddled with typhoid, and Inglis was a great believer in fresh air and hygiene. They were two absolute essentials for nursing and medical care, and so she had Serbia disinfected, and the women set up a unit. She had a number of other surgeons with her. One was a diminutive, she was about 4'6", woman by the name of Alice Hutchison. And the women went off in different groups to set up their hospitals. Now, the area where Alice and her Scottish women nurses were serving was soon overrun by the Austrians, and the women were taken prisoner. Now, that is strictly against the rules of war, because medical personnel are neutral, and therefore, as they're neutral, they're non-combatant, and they cannot be taken prisoner. Now, Alice, who was a fluent German speaker, spent her time reminding the commandant of the prison where the women were being helped that this was against the rules of war. And in order to annoy him, she draped herself in the Union flag, which she wore underneath her thin muslin blouse, and she was quite convinced that chivalry was such in those times that the blouse would not be ripped off her and the flag removed. She proved right. So every day she was interviewed. But Alice actually was very forward-thinking for her time, and she was aware that women who were used to working extremely hard, suddenly found themselves with nothing to do, needed to be kept occupied. So she decided to sort of create a home situation in their prison of war camp. Every morning, the troop of 32 nurses had to undertake a German lesson. She taught them German because I suppose she thought they could then go and harangue the prison commandant as well. Then they had to play rounders or hockey. You know, good English British women were going to have some physical exercise, so they had a long hockey session. Then they were served soup in a bucket, so they had their soup. And then, and I think this is really almost the pièce de résistance, every afternoon they were taken on a field march which consisted of 6 miles cross-country, surrounded by Austrian guards. Now, the Austrian Guards, after 2 days of this activity, they went up and had a word with the prison commandant and said they couldn't possibly keep up with these women. It would be all right if they walked, but they flew across the ground like little grey geese. And please, sir, could we have a rest in the morning? So the guards who were going to accompany the women on their marches had to take to their beds in the morning in order to get up energy for their walk in the afternoon. Alice and her women came home. Now, we mentioned cleanliness. Cleanliness is next to godliness. So they sort of organised an arras with a bowl of boiling water, and the women, so that modesty could be preserved, had to take a full wash behind the arras, using the water, and woe betide anybody who didn't keep the kettle boiling, so there was some for the next group. And then after that, they played charades, very British idea to play charades, and then they, under their breath, sung the national anthem before they collapsed into bed at 10:30, sleeping, I should believe, the sleep of the exhausted after this regime. And the locals became rather impressed by the Scottish women because they were so clean. So they suggested to the commandant that if he would like to release some of the women, they would marry them. They rather fancied a Scottish wife. The women begged to differ. They were eventually released, and Alice had kept a diary. This is how we know all her stories and what happened to the women. She kept a diary, and when all their baggage was being checked before they could be released, she tore the pages out of the diary, tore them into shreds, stuffed them in a cushion, which, because she was so tall, she actually stood on the cushion, and when she was interviewed to make sure that she had nothing with her, nobody realised that she'd suddenly grown a couple of inches, and so she smuggled the diary out of the camp, and as they crossed the border into Switzerland, she whipped the flag out of her, the British Union Jack, out of her baggage, and she waved it out of the window as the women left for Switzerland and subsequently for the United Kingdom. That is just one of the many stories about the amazing women of the First World War.
A round of applause for Alice. Wow, and for Viv. Keep hold of your microphone, Viv. If anyone has a question to ask Viv when it comes to the role of women in particular in World War One, then now is the chance to ask your question. What an incredible story! So women make quite tough prisoner of war.
They make very tough prisoners of war, and they were not going to make good wives either.
Too right. Any questions for Viv, Dr. Viv Newman, who has written a book about this very
book
subject?
Plug time.
Yeah.
Going to be published in November. We also served the forgotten women of the First World War. Stories like Alice and many, many others are in there.
Good stuff. Okay, we've got a question from a lady at the back.
Is there an example of where women were used in the front line in the clearing stations as doctors and nurses?
There is indeed. Maybe that will be a story for the next session. But in fact, there were women working in the casualty clearing stations on the front line, and some of them formed what we would call rapid response units, where basically teams of nurses and surgeons were rushed from one casualty clearing station that was being overwhelmed to another one, set up their mobile hospital, worked for 16 hours on the trot, packed up, and then moved to the next casualty clearing station. I don't know if any of you have heard about the 3 Peaks Challenge, where you climb the 3 highest peaks in the United Kingdom in one day. I think being a member of a rapid response team was a little bit like that, because the only sleep you could get before you moved to your next casualty clearing station was in the ambulance. And so they worked sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks on end, and although the women were advised to take warm pyjamas rather than beribboned night dresses with them when they went to casualty clearing stations, I don't think they even had the chance to put on their pyjamas.
One more question. Have we got one more question about women in World War One for our guest today, Dr. Viv Newman? We'll see if we can get the microphone to stretch.
Can I pose a question about something that's very dear to me and to the east of England generally, and that's the Women's Land Army. 23,000 women were in that nationally. Can you tell us something about it, Viv?
Yes, briefly. The Women's Land Army was set up big time, although women had been working on the land throughout the war. But in 1917, the country was actually close to starvation because of the amount of food. Britain was very dependent on bringing in food from overseas and from the dominions and from the colonies. Shipping was being sunk at an absolutely horrific rate. The country was close to starvation, and there was an absolute need to make the land more productive again, and this led to the creation of the Women's Land Army. We tend to think of the land girls of the Second World War. The Land Army of the First World War was its predecessor, and the women actually kept starvation at bay. So in the same way as we say, if there hadn't been women working in the munitions factories, we would never have had enough shells and ammunition. Without the women working on the land, the country would almost certainly have been starved into submission.
And that's where we have to leave it for now. But ladies and gentlemen, your appreciation for Dr. Viv Newman.